Guys, it's great to be with you this morning. Who has had an absolutely brilliant week? Oh, that's great. Oh, thank God. Thank God. Who hasn't? Yeah, a few of us. Yeah, it was all right. Yeah, it was all right. Who was all right? Yeah, it was all right. Good. I want to speak to you this morning about the subject of intimacy, specifically intimacy with God. But I think there is an intimacy that, as a church, we need to experience with one another as well. And I think we've experienced a little bit of that this morning, just sharing from the heart and just listening to God, responding to His voice in the room, and being vulnerable with one another as we share that. Now, intimacy, I should probably have waited until the men got back from their men's weekend doing manly men things, because, intimacy is probably the furthest thing from their minds right now, or at least it better be if they're going to be men, I'm sure I'm doing all of them an injustice, and they're all having a good cathartic cry with each other, as well as all the, off-color jokes and flatulence. But intimacy isn't just a problem for men. I wonder if it's something that we all struggle with. Maybe it's because we're British, most of us, some of us. Maybe it's just because we're human. Maybe we just don't like to be vulnerable, to be exposed. It sets us up for disappointment and pain, doesn't it? Intimacy is one of the 5 worship values that we treasure in the Vineyard. I've literally written a book, or a booklet, about worship values in the Vineyard, and I talk about intimacy in there, so if you're interested in that, you can probably, I don't know where you get it. It's probably one of those shopping channels, where they said, this is not available in the stores. Send a postal order to P.O. Box, whatever. You'll find it if you want. If you really want to find it, you'll find it. It's called Vineyard Worship Values. Anyway, that's more of a kind of theological approach, but what I want to talk about this morning is a couple of 3 kind of portraits of intimacy, just 3 different examples in the Bible of intimacy with God, and I want to draw out some of the characteristics of that intimacy. And one of the things I hope that we can learn from this is that we feel free to just come to God as we are right now. And in the same way that we feel we can come to each other exactly as we are right now, without putting on airs, without putting on a mask or a show of what we think will be sort of acceptable. Because when it comes to God, it's not our righteousness, it's not our goodness that qualifies us to come into God's presence. It's the righteousness of Jesus and the power that is that we're blessed with by His shedding of blood, by His giving over of His own goodness, of His own righteousness. But we do need to know that intimacy is something that is kind of a non-negotiable part of what it means to be a Christian. Because if we call Jesus our Lord, then we have to give Him access to every single part of us. And I once heard it said that if we have not made God Lord of all, then He is not Lord at all. We need to surrender everything to Him. So these 3 portraits of intimacy with God start with Moses and Joshua in Exodus. And I'm going to read now from Exodus chapter 33, verses 3 to 11. This is God speaking at first. He says, "Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you because you are a stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way. And when the people heard these distressing words, they began to mourn, and no one put on any ornaments. For the Lord had said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites, you are a stiff-necked people. If I were to go with you, even for a moment, I might destroy you. Take off your ornaments, and I'll decide what to do with you." So they stripped off their ornaments at Mount Horeb. Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp, some distance away, and called it the tent of meeting. And anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp. And whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people rose and stood at the entrances to their tents, watching Moses until he entered the tent. As Moses went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and stay at the entrance while the Lord spoke with Moses. Whenever the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance to the tent, they all stood and worshipped, each at the entrance to their tent. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent. There's a couple of reasons I've selected this passage. The backstory to this moment is in the previous chapter, Moses had gone up the mountain, like the men have this weekend. They'd gone up the mountain to seek God, to hear his voice, and meanwhile, the people below have been really impatient, and they've taken a whole bunch of their gold, all of their jewelry, their rings, their chains, their bracelets. They've melted it all down, and they've turned it into this golden calf. They wanted to create themselves for a god, create for themselves a god to replace the one that they were basically fed up waiting for. And God, in response, is now saying they have messed up so badly that they should be afraid of his presence. Their disdain for him is so great, and their rebelliousness comes so easy to them, that the awesome and pure light of God's goodness threatens to literally wipe them out. And yet, God gives them an instruction. Simply take off your jewelry and all your fine clothes and all the ways in which they've covered themselves in stuff, which is ultimately the raw ingredients for unfaithfulness and idolatry. And then he welcomes them back into his presence. And I think what he's saying is this. He's saying everything that you have accumulated in your life to try to make it in this life, to try to present yourself as worthy, you need to get rid of it. It does nothing but get in the way. Strip it off. Come into God's presence with nothing but yourself. The other thing I find interesting about this passage is Joshua choosing to linger in that space. There's these kind of three different examples of connection with God in this passage, aren't there? There's the people who watch Moses speak to God. There's Moses who speaks to God. And there's Joshua who just wants to be near God. And he just wants to stay there. I'll say a little bit more about this intimacy in a moment, but I want to move now to our second portrait, and a guy called Thomas. Thomas is one of Jesus' 12 disciples. We know him as Doubting Thomas because he does one thing and he gets slandered for the rest of his life. Doubting Thomas doubted. And we're going to read about him quickly in John chapter 20, verses 24 to 29. Thomas, also known as Didymus, which basically is the same name in another language. He was one of the 12, and he was not with the disciples when Jesus came. This is when Jesus revealed himself after he rose from the dead. And the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." And a week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. And though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." And Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And so we have famously for centuries called Thomas Doubting Thomas, as though that were a really bad thing. But Jesus doesn't berate him or belittle him for doubting. He gladly says, "Come, put your hands in my side." I don't know if any of you have seen, there's a painting that I love by Caravaggio called, I think it's called Thomas Incredulus or something like that. And it's Thomas basically sticking his hand into the wound that was left in Jesus' side after the spear pierced him. And it's quite a vivid picture because he's got his hand stuck in Jesus. And Jesus is literally holding his hand like this, saying, "Come on." Like, Jesus is not reluctantly letting Thomas test the thing that will cause him to believe. Jesus is saying, "Come and have a go." Like, if anybody's nervous, it's Thomas, but Jesus is grabbing his hand. I love that. Come on. Stick it in there. And I think this is a picture of intimacy where Jesus invites our unbelief and invites us to test and examine the validity of Jesus' claims about himself. It's okay that you don't know what you believe about him. He's not afraid of scrutiny. There's a lot of false hope being spun out there, and we are encouraged in the Word to test and weigh everything that we see and everything that we hear. And when you really get into it, when you really take seriously Jesus' claims about himself and his invitation to put him under scrutiny, like Thomas, we can discover resurrection life. But you've got to get up close and personal. You've got to get your hands stuck in. You've got to experience it for yourself. The third portrait is of a woman who is not named in the Gospels, but who appears in various ways in all four Gospels. I'm going to read from Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 48. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, behind him at his feet, you need to imagine Jesus is kind of sort of reclining, so he's kind of lying down, he's facing this way, his feet are over here, so she's behind him, weeping. She began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." Spoiler alert, Jesus knew who she was. And so Jesus answered him, "Simon, I've got something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher," he said. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Which one will love him more? And Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, says Jesus. And then he turned to the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. And Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. I want us just for a moment to try and use our imaginations to try and get ourselves into the minds of all of these people that we've just briefly looked at. So into the minds of Moses and Joshua, into the mind of Thomas, into the mind of this unnamed woman. First, with Moses and Joshua, let's try and think about where their heads are at. They've literally just heard from God that he is so mad with them for their unfaithfulness that he's not going to go with them into the promised land. And so right now, at that point, Moses and Joshua are clinging on to the presence of God like it's the last day they're ever going to experience it. Moses pleads with God, don't send us if you're not going to go with us. If you're not coming, let us stay. It's your presence that we want, your presence that we need. And God does indeed decide and then promise to go with them. The lesson I think we need to learn is that we mustn't ever take God's presence for granted. Now, don't hear me say God will ever leave you. He won't. But there's a difference between God's promise to remain with us and our decision not to just be apathetic to God's presence. I don't know if you know this, but I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but presence is a two-way street. I have, on occasion, been told things by my wife which I have then failed to remember having heard. That happened once, I think. Once per hour. I don't know if that's something you can relate to. If you've ever sort of had a conversation which you couldn't remember having. I think in that moment, Marie was present to me, but I was not particularly present to her. And so I think presence is a two-way street. I think we can take God's presence with us for granted. We can take his promise to always be with us as an excuse to become indifferent and apathetic towards his presence. Instead, I think we need to learn from Moses and Joshua here and learn to cling on to the presence of Jesus as though it was our last day. It was our last chance. His presence will always be with us, but we need to be present to him also. And I think, like Moses and Joshua and like the people, we need to strip ourselves of all the things that we've accumulated. They cling on to us and entangle us so that we might come unadorned into God's presence. What about Thomas? Let's try and get into the mind of Thomas for a minute. Everyone that he knows and presumably trusts is telling him something that cannot possibly be true. It's wishful thinking to claim that this Jesus who he loved has died a completely unjustified early death, and now he's alive again. And everyone around him is overjoyed at just hearing what happened, but no amount of trying can cause him to believe it. He will not believe it until he's seen it with his own eyes, touched Jesus with his own hands. The experience of others cannot stand in for an experience of his own. The disparaging way in which we talk about Thomas needs to be thought of in that light. I don't blame him. Somebody else's experience cannot stand in for my own. But he wouldn't have had that personal experience if he hadn't been in the room looking for it. If he hadn't trusted his friends enough to stay and make sure that the opportunity of a personal experience to meet with the resurrected Jesus didn't pass him by. So he didn't doubt so much that he walked away. He stayed. He waited for Jesus, and he was not disappointed. What about the woman? Let's try and get into her mind. So Jesus is dining at a prominent Pharisee's house. She hasn't been invited. It's not the sort of event where a person like her would be invited. These are not the kinds of people who want anything to do with her, except perhaps if they want to avail themselves of her services. If they have it in mind to use her and abuse her. And yet, Jesus ends up criticizing the hospitality shown to him by his host in comparison to the attentive love and care given to him by her. And yet her motivation, she's not there to show up the Pharisees. She's just there to be with Jesus, to express her love for him, her devotion to him, to get close to him. So there's three things that I think we can learn from these three portraits, and then I'm going to finish and we're going to pray. The first thing is this: that the invitation to come as we are into God's presence and into presence with one another is an invitation to bring your unadorned, authentic self. Bring it undecorated, unclean, unfaithful, unworthy. Come as you are into the presence of God. And like Thomas, come doubting, come disbelieving, come prepared to test what God claims about himself, what Jesus claims about himself, and see if he doesn't just show you. And third, like the woman, bring your tears and bring your treasures as well, like the perfume, and give everything to him. Throw yourself upon his mercy, because although he knows everything you have ever done and everything you will ever do, he welcomes a broken and a contrite heart, and he will restore it to life. Hebrews chapter 12 talks about pursuing Jesus as though in a kind of race. And he says, if you're going to run this race, you need to throw off all the things that are clinging onto you, that are hindering you on this journey. There's so much that we have made a condition of entering into worship, of entering into God's presence, that God says, no, I've dealt with all of that. I've created the conditions for you to come into my presence. Don't wait. Do it now, as you are.